Hello. As you said, I'm Emily Freeman. I am a developer advocate for Microsoft, which is just a really fancy way of saying my job is to travel around, speak to you all, and then take your product feedback back to our engineering teams so that we can make sure Azure builds products with you in mind. I wrapped my book, my first book, DevOps for Dummies, about 2 weeks ago. It'll be released later this summer. But I don't particularly want to talk about DevOps for Dummies or its contents. You'll hear plenty of the fundamentals and implementation of DevOps over the next 2 days. Instead, I want to set the tone for this event. I want to talk about my experience writing the book, about creating something from nothing, and how I believe the creative process parallels our work as engineers. My editor would like me to let you know that you can pre-order the book on Amazon, and I would absolutely love to hear what you think once it's out. Writing a book is the hardest achievement I have set out to accomplish. I finished it like a marathoner at the end of a long race, crawling toward the finish line. I was empty. But finishing the book isn't actually the interesting story. The journey is where I learned the valuable lessons. Only in the tears and the toil, in the mud of my own emotions and self-doubt, did I learn the truths of struggle, resiliency, and creative work. Long ago, communities believed a person's creative contributions were the work of a muse. They believed the gifts we treasure most from those ancient civilizations, sculptures, paintings, books, were the result of a human momentarily capturing the divine. And you don't have to believe in a God to recognize when someone has, for a moment, transcended the limitations of human brokenness and created something truly awe-inspiring. When the era of the muse passed, we discovered science. We began to understand pieces of the universe we inhabit. We moved away from the old godlike division of labor. We stopped recognizing the muses and the gods and the divine. We praised the art, but more importantly, we began to worship humans. We began to believe that those artists and creators were somehow superior, that they knew something the rest of us didn't. Engineering software is creative work. Yes, we talk about algorithms and lambdas, but I think our work transcends science and technology. It is creative in its nature. And throughout that creative process of building something from nothing, we must strike this balance between influencing the outcome and stepping back to allow the work to define itself. If I were to write a book on writing books, it would be titled Lessons Learned in Staring at Carpet Fibers, because you spend a lot of time rolling around on the floor, wallowing in your own self-pity, before you ever write a single word. Michelangelo, the man who brought us David and the Pietà, believed every block of stone had a statue in it, and it was the task of the sculptor to uncover it. And maybe, go with me on this, maybe we are sculptors, slowly chipping away at marble until the sculpture beneath begins to surface. Only instead of a chisel in hand, we type away at our keyboards, coaxing machines to do our will. Now, I know engineering doesn't feel all that glamorous, whether you're on the ops or dev side. I think engineering can be extremely lonely work. And if you're anything like me, it can fill you with imposter syndrome and self-doubt just as quickly as it can make you feel like a god. In many ways, this industry has created a cult of celebrity, of influencers. We worship the technologists who have the most Twitter followers or open source contributions. We look to the people on stages like this one as experts instead of what they actually are, which is peers. And we seek to prove ourselves worthy instead of creating a community and a culture of acceptance and vulnerability. I did more than think about DevOps while writing this book. I thought a lot about where I fit into this community and the type of environment we're building in tech. If you're new to DevOps, you'll notice we talk a lot about people, process, and tools, in that order. Because the tools you use are far less important than the people for whom you build products and the people with whom you work. But I want to focus on that second item in the list, process. For me, the process of writing, like software development, has a rhythm, an emotional ebb and flow. This is the Gartner hype cycle. Gartner uses it to teach Fortune 500 companies how to make more money. But I think it does a good job of capturing the emotional rise and fall, or really plummet, we experience as humans every time we take on a big project, something new. When I was offered the book, I felt elated. I haven't felt joy and anticipation like that in years. I felt like I had arrived, like I was a success. And I kept imagining walking into the bookstore, finding the book, pulling it off the shelf, and holding it. How good that would feel. That feeling is the peak of inflated expectations. It's your brain dumping large amounts of dopamine into your system. I imagined myself like Hemingway, typing away and clearly conveying my thoughts on DevOps, minus the Cuban views and rum, though more on rum and other booze later. I wasn't like Hemingway. It wasn't sexy. It was not glamorous. It was hard. It was lonely. It was a lot of work. It felt daunting, impossible, and I felt like I was going to be the biggest disappointment, especially to the people who had taken a risk on me as a first-time author. I really struggled. I don't want to gloss over that fact, because I think too often we see the highlight reel of other people, and we compare it to the behind-the-scenes footage of our own internal shit show. It's a false comparison, and it isolates us from each other. I think it cheats us of truth and community, something I think is central to DevOps organizations. The closer we're able to get to a shared experience, the more we begin to understand each other as humans. The struggle that follows the peak of inflated expectations is the trough of disillusionment. This is your brain viewing the opportunity as a danger to your safety. Your brain was actually never designed to help you become your most enlightened self, nor was it designed to help you accomplish feats of grandeur. It was designed to keep you alive. The oldest part of your brain, right back here, basically thinks your job is to be born, survive into reproductive age, and replicate your cells. And that's about it. Your brain views opportunity as risk, and it sees risk as a lion that wants to eat you. Your brain will always opt for safety over uncertainty, even if it means you miss out on opportunities. It's this part of your brain that you're at war with during the trough of disillusionment. It's a dark time, and I spent much of my time writing in this phase. The only reason I was able to keep producing, despite the intense struggle, was because I had friends, many of whom are authors, who gave me endless pep talks and kept me going when I wanted to throw in the towel and quit. I tweeted this in early December, when I was about 30% of the way through the book. It is alarmingly accurate. And if you really look at it and change a few words, it probably mirrors some of your experiences engineering solutions to really hard problems. The first step is to hem and haw. This is the procrastination phase. It's the roll around on the floor until you feel slightly less overwhelmed phase. In this part of the trough of disillusionment, you'll think about writing, but you'll get distracted by the state of disorder in your closet, or your sudden need for freshly baked cookies. I stress bake, so you can imagine how many cookies and cakes I've had over the last 6 months. It's not good. Let's not tell my doctor. This is between you and me. Step 2 is to question your credentials. Imposter syndrome is such a trip. This phase is mostly listening to that little voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you shouldn't even try, that someone else would be better. As you might know, tech is my second career. I don't have a CS degree, I did not build a server farm in my parents' garage, and I did not teach myself Fortran at 15. In this phase, the incessant whisper of doubt left me feeling like I wasn't qualified. And I became obsessed with what Gene Kim would think of my book. If you don't know, Gene Kim has authored or co-authored nearly every book in DevOps. And I spent months thinking that DevOps for Dummies would be such a disappointment to Gene, until I finally got it through my thick skull that he didn't know who I was and didn't really care. Step 3 is to experience an existential crisis. I feel like millennials are known for this in avocado toast. You may or may not need a therapist and/or a friendly bartender to get through the self-doubt initiated from your negative self-talk. I did most of my writing at night. I work a full-time job at Microsoft, I travel a lot for conferences, and I'm a single mom, which means my evenings are monopolized by my amazing but demanding 4-year-old daughter. I'd put my daughter in bed and sit next to her, hunched over my laptop in the dark. My back is permanently damaged, I'm pretty sure. That cursor would just sit there on the blank page, taunting me, blinking, 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 reminding me that I'd written absolutely nothing, zilch. Until by some miracle, I would happen to type some words onto the page. On nights and weekends when my daughter was with her dad, I would go down to the bar below my apartment to write. I was there so often with my laptop that regulars started to make questions or ask questions and make comments. And it was there that I would have a momentary lift of productivity. I'd feel good, until I made the mistake of reading what I had just written and hated it. And then in my dismay, I would draw diagrams, because if I couldn't write a good book, I was gonna make a damn good picture book. When I realized Wiley wouldn't pay me for 250 pages of charts and graphics, I managed to write some more, at which point I would begin drinking, or more likely continued drinking, before I collapsed into bed for the evening. After a break away from the work, I'd review it and, wait a minute, love it? What? I'm a genius. Of course I deserve to be writing a book. That momentary feeling of greatness would be quickly swept away by a sense of uneasiness washing over me. I'd return crashing to earth, feeling utterly confused as to how the piece of crap I wrote last night turned into great writing by morning. And the whisper of imposter syndrome would return, reminding me that someone else would think it's crap and would tell me just that in big, bold, red edits. I spent months in the trough of disillusionment until I began to normalize. I realized that I was writing a book on DevOps, not the book on DevOps. And if it sucked, who really cared? If the trough of disillusionment is that moment you jump out of the plane and begin to plummet toward Earth, the slope of enlightenment is the moment after your parachute opens, your rate of descent steadies, and you begin to calmly take in the world around you. You realize that the emotional ups and downs are just part of the process, and that that process will eventually end, at which point you'll reach the plateau of productivity, where you finally feel like you have some clue what you're doing. And you know that if you just keep writing, you'll have time to edit it into something at least mediocre, probably good, and maybe, just maybe, great. So after all that, who is excited about writing a book? But seriously, if you were wondering if I'd recommend writing a book, the answer is absolutely yes. Thanks to authority bias, we give authors way too much credit. Everyone assumes they're an expert. They wrote a book, right? I grew a lot as a person and a professional while writing, and the lessons I learned in the struggle, how I can apply them to my work in engineering, were beyond valuable. Just recognize that it's not glamorous. It's a marathon through mud, and it's easier to quit than to fight through the struggle. Some of the best advice I received about the book came from my colleague, Oren Thomas. He said the first book is always the hardest because you don't know you can finish it. You may think you can, but you don't know it. And I think Oren is right, not just about writing books, but any big challenge that faces you. The first time you do anything is the hardest, which is why you need to make a plan, and then probably throw it away. Creating a table of contents is the first step of writing a book. The publisher literally demands it. It's sort of the planning phase of a book. And plans are great. They manage to get you headed in a particular direction. But sometimes, I'd argue most times, at some point you need to throw it away because you can't get to the destination unless you toss that original plan, which, as you might imagine, might give your manager a bit of a stroke. But tossing the plan isn't failure. It's adaptation. It's continuous improvement, a concept central to DevOps. There's this moment in creative work, and perhaps especially in writing, where the work begins to declare itself. And the image of what you thought the book would be meets what the book believes itself to be. Now that sounds a bit wacky, right? I'm anthropomorphizing a book and claiming that it will guide you into being the book it wants to be. But that's exactly what happens. My father calls this part of writing catching fire. And it's where the toil of typing transforms into flow. And I'm not talking about value stream mapping. I'm talking about the Mihai Csikszentmihalyi concept of flow, a state of being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies, every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. If you're a developer, you've likely felt this at some point in your career. After a struggle at the start, the code sort of begins to write itself, and you've overcome that initial challenge to begin to know what you need to do next. A plan is a guide, not a prison. You are never locked into the strategy you thought would work. When you're staring at a mountain, you can make assumptions about how to climb it, which paths to take, what challenges you might face, though lines on Mount Everest are rather new. But it's not until you're 2 hours from base camp and a snowstorm moves in that you really know what you need to do next. Don't stick to an original plan just because it's convenient. Instead, make adjustments, iterate, pivot. But don't expect that adaptation to be smooth. Growth is painful. It's also part of the process. I grew an incredible amount through writing this book as a person, a writer, a technologist. But growth is awkward and uncomfortable. It exposes the areas in which you aren't particularly impressive, which requires candor and vulnerability. It would be much easier to act like you know everything, like you've got it all handled. Only the most courageous among us freely admit what they don't know and create space for those around them to teach, which is beautiful. This entire process was a daily reminder that the more I learn, the less I know, and that ego is the enemy of learning. When I joined a powerlifting team years ago, they had one rule. I had to leave my ego at the door. There was simply no room for pride. And no, I've never had quads like that. That woman is a beast, and I'm jealous. My little group of powerlifters pushed me more than any other group ever has. And there is nothing like a 300-pound man yelling at you because you didn't try hard enough. It was the epitome of tough love. They pushed me because they loved me, and they believed in me, even when I didn't believe in me. We talk a lot about removing friction from teams and allowing people to work well together, and that's important. But a certain amount of friction is actually really healthy, because that's how we grow. And as long as it's in a safe and healthy environment, working through that friction with your friends and colleagues can help you build real trust and community. Don't fight procrastination. It's part of the process. Writing a book is torturous because when you're writing, you hate writing. And when you're not writing, you feel guilty because you should be writing. I spent a lot of time procrastinating. I baked, I cleaned, I watched TV, I moaned to friends. I delayed. But by the end, I realized that procrastination is actually a really healthy part of the creative process. You're not avoiding work, mostly. You're doing work. It just doesn't feel like that. All the time I was rolling around in the carpet, complaining, my brain was sorting out how I wanted to tackle a topic as broad and encompassing as DevOps. And eventually, all the procrastination work paid off. I think I've actually written a pretty good book. But that said, the first draft is going to suck. How many of you have spent a week working on a hard problem in code, creating a gnarly string of code, only to throw it all away and rewrite it elegantly in just a few hours? You can't edit nothing, but you can polish a turd. Terry Pratchett said the first draft is just telling yourself the story, which is beautiful. Though I personally prefer Hemingway's honest take, it's much more my style. The first draft of anything is shit. And maybe the first draft is horrible. You'll make it better. But you have to start somewhere. Perfection is impossible. We are humans, we are flawed. There is nothing empirically perfect on the face of this earth. But I believe in the pursuit of perfection, we can achieve greatness. This is the Nike of Samothrace, the winged victory, or Nike alighting a warship. Nike is the personification of victory, and this statue at the Louvre is one of my favorites. There are moments of absolute perfection in this statue. Look at her belly, how the fabric sweeps around her body in the wind. The sculptor made stone delicate, translucent. That, for me, is absolutely divine. But the sculpture as a whole has some problems. For one, she's missing a head. Now, that's not the sculptor's fault, right? But it is a wonderful metaphor for creative output. We have so little control over the outcomes of our work, how it's received, if it's ever even remembered. The only thing we have control over is the work we put into it and the personal growth we glean from the experience. Maybe that's how we should measure ourselves and each other, by the input, the work, and remind ourselves that that's so much more important than the outcome. Which brings me to my last point. We need each other. I want to go back to step number 8 for a minute and be really real with you. I drank too much writing this book. One liver was harmed in the writing of this book. When I was writing, I was drinking, and it got to the point that I felt like I couldn't write unless there was a glass of wine next to me. Stephen King talks about this. The drugs and alcohol became such a deep-seated part of his writing process that he feared he could never quit because he couldn't write without it. Drinking while writing, I think, was a way of quieting the fears of failure and attempting to make a brutal and endless process somewhat enjoyable. For me, I think we drink and we do drugs and we gamble and we do 1,000 other things we shouldn't do because of our own fears and anxiety. That thought's really heavy, but I think so is the experience of being human. And I think at the core of each of us is maybe a small child who's a little bit scared and who wants to belong. The fear and anxiety many of us carry around every day can become crushing, so oppressive that you begin to feel like you can't even breathe. I want you to know that wherever you're at, you're not alone. Even when you feel the loneliest, even when you feel like you have no one to call, we are here. We all struggle. And if we could create an environment of courageous vulnerability, we wouldn't have to be alone. We could struggle together. And it's for this reason that I want to go back to the ethos of the age of the muse, when the brilliant work of an artist was a human momentarily capturing the divine. Because if you believe you create great work, work that exceeds the reaches of average humans, all on your own, and then you fail, what does that say about you? And more than that, how can we possibly form meaningful connections with each other if we see some humans as demigods? Community, trust, requires each of us to view ourselves as equals. We must stop putting people on pedestals, for them and for us. We must be a community in which everyone respects and admires the different contributions of each individual. As you go about the next 2 days at this conference, you'll have the opportunity to meet hundreds of engineers. There are roughly 900 of you here. And later this afternoon, we'll have open spaces, a sort of choose-your-own-adventure way of breaking out into small groups and talking about the things that are important to you. In these groups and other conversations, I challenge you to be vulnerable with your peers, to share your successes and your failures freely and courageously. Being vulnerable is one of the most courageous acts any of us can take. If someone is brave enough to be real with you, to be their authentic self with you, meet them where they're at. Accept them and return that gift of vulnerability. Maybe, just maybe, we can all go back to our workplaces and show that it's not actually tech at the heart of DevOps. It's humans. It's you. Thank you.